Hello and welcome to this episode of The Brief. I'm your host, Meredith Reed. I'm here today with Clara Tsao. She's a national security and disinformation expert and a technology entrepreneur. She is currently building the Trust and Safety Professional Association to support the global community of professionals who develop and enforce policies that define acceptable content and behavior online. Clara is also president of the White House Presidential Innovation Fellows Foundation, senior advisor at the UN-CTED-backed Tech Against Terrorism, and has held various national security and tech policy roles for the US government, Google, and Mozilla. Welcome, Clara.
Thank you for having me. It's so exciting to be on this show. There's so many great people you've interviewed, so I'm really honored to be on this.
Well, we're so happy to have you on. You're already well connected with a lot of people at Spectrum Labs. We just love you. We're so happy to have you on the podcast. So can you just start by telling us a little bit about your nonprofit that you're launching and why this became an area of passion for you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So to take a step back, I'm happy to give a little bit of history on how I got started in this space. I've always been fascinated with how people behave online, and most of my career has been at the intersection of technology and policy. And trust and safety as a field is really the combination of these two. You have a lot of people who are dealing with real world challenges that come from more and more information that they see online. And you have a number of professionals that are growing that have to adjudicate and decide what is acceptable behavior or content and how do we police against that. A lot of times there's been government regulation that have started to help companies think through what could go very wrong, from child pornography in the early days to terrorist content. But you're seeing an increasingly large group of specialized professionals that have to suddenly learn about COVID disinformation, medical issues, and deciding how to remove something that could multiply very quickly and go viral, and could have actually people drinking bleach, which has happened, where a lot of people have had to issue warnings. So a little bit about my background. I had always been very much scouring the internet in my free time, love chat rooms, love looking at just the weird, different rabbit holes of websites that people do and the way people behave bizarrely. When I was around 6 years ago, I was at Microsoft working there actually in worldwide education, completely different field, but was involved in a project in Myanmar where we were looking at disinformation and election integrity in a country where it had not had a democratic election for years. And this was the first time after a long military regime that the government was actually going to go through a democratic election process. However, Myanmar is very much behind the times. They actually didn't even have a credit card to the early 2010 or 2011 in their economy. And when I started working with different people in Myanmar, they were telling me that Facebook was really the internet to them. And I saw a huge wave of people go from 30% to 70% internet penetration, mostly all using Facebook. And at the time, Facebook actually didn't have anyone that really knew Burmese that could really speak to defining what was acceptable content on their platform. So disinformation went completely rampant. There were people that pretended to be journalists that did not come from journalist backgrounds. You can imagine the 2016 elections and what had happened in disinformation there taking place in 2013 and 2014 in Myanmar. And for me, that was a really interesting point in my career where I really saw through the eyes of people that were there on the ground, the impact that disinformation really had to people in an offline world. And there were people that were being accused of raping others. And, you know, there were mobs of people getting into violent fights over disinformation. And I remember thinking in my head, this will probably not be an issue that the Western world cares about till it hits a Western democracy, because that's historically how history has worked. So that was really my first exposure into the space. Even though I was at Microsoft, I actually still had a lot of people I knew at Facebook, and I actually flagged this issue for them to say, you guys should look into this. Language is a huge issue. Facebook actually defined the way people spoke online in the dialect they chose in Myanmar. And that's really powerful because for generations to come, when people speak in Myanmar, they're using a language that company decided. So those are really important consequences of decision making that people at companies often make, sometimes blindly, not knowing the responsibility of their information at scale. The other really big issue that took place was shortly after the Burmese government started to do basically a ethnic genocide against a lot of what was happening in the online space. They took advantage of it, and after a while, Facebook now has a team that looks at Myanmar, but at the time it did not exist. So that was really the wake up moment for me to really be passionate about this space. I left Microsoft shortly after and decided to spend some time in US government. And while I was serving in US government, I joined through a program called the White House Presidential Innovation Fellows that brings entrepreneurs and technologists to really learn about how government works, and also to be able to solve things using different expertise and backgrounds. So I ended up getting recruited to serve as a CTO of a team looking at countering violent extremism, which in the US is a big problem because the First Amendment protects a lot of people from protects people to be able to speak their mind. But at the same time, when it comes to hate speech, it's really hard to police against that and deciding where that line is drawn. Even today, there are a lot of groups that can't even decide what is a domestic terrorist organization and what's not. And you would think about the increasing role that companies play. It's even harder for people that may not have training in a certain field to make those roles and make those decisions, whether they realize they're doing it or not. And so my work in countering violent extremism was really fascinating because there was a lot of blurry lines that no one had clear answers to. It wasn't the government, it wasn't companies. It really became, a lot of other decisions that might come from users deciding that they've had enough. They might say like, we don't want, it could be advertisers deciding we don't want our advertisement on top of ISIS videos. So they really revolted against, certain companies. Sometimes it took Charlottesville, where you had companies like Cloudflare that actually worked together with GoDaddy to prevent certain white extremist sites from being online after something like that happened. So that was a really interesting experience for me to really look at a subset of a topic. And shortly after that, I ended up helping stand up a new team after the 2016 elections focused on disinformation and foreign influence operations, which became a lot harder than just hate speech online and terrorist organizations. Now you have this additional issue of potentially other states having bot networks pretending to be Americans, and a lot of other issues that emerge from there. So that's a little bit of my background. So around a year ago, I was with Mozilla and I was looking at a lot of content policies across platforms, and I started to build a new organization, really focused on training people that do this work day to day, that work in trust and safety at companies with the right resources to be able to be effective and to be able to have the right support. A lot of trust and safety teams at companies, they're born out of a crisis moment that happens within companies. And a lot of times the process of who to hire and being able to support the individuals that do this work is done with very limited support, with consideration of mental health, with consideration around the power that they're given in order to make certain decisions. So a lot of people feel often unprepared in a lot of challenging decisions that have to be made. So this new organization, the Trust and Safety Professional Association, is launching soon. And the goal is to really help train professionals to have a shared community of practice and to be able to elevate the space, to be able to elevate the field, and be able to empower people to have access to a lot of resources and best practices that people years ago have created, but has been siloed within company boundaries. So I'll pause there. I know I was speaking for a while.
And that's why it's so important to have an organization like this that is advocating for trust and safety departments at different companies. If you look at the way that technology has grown and the way things have unfolded, it's been so problematic, not having policies and not having government that's been able to keep up with how do we regulate these platforms. They've really just grown exponentially, and you're right. I think a lot of times it does take a crisis and something really terrible happening before some of these issues are addressed. So I'm really interested to hear more about your organization. But first I want to ask you, how do you view the responsibility of a platform for the trust and safety of their users?
Sorry, your connection broke up a little bit, but I'll just repeat the question. I definitely think there's different approaches to how a large company handles trust and safety and how smaller ones are able to handle it. What's fascinating about the internet is you can have a platform used by a lot of people, but have limited resources. So in the instance of terrorist content online, years ago, there was a company called Just Paste It, and they had, it was created by a graduate student who had created this file sharing site for fun, and it was his baby, and it got taken over by ISIS, and suddenly he got so much law enforcement requests, he suddenly had to make a decision on whether to shut down his company or comply. And if you think about a one-person company running a file sharing site that suddenly needs to become a terrorist content expert overnight, it's very, very hard. So historically, in 2016, a number of companies came together to form the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. It's between Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, specifically YouTube, to really help smaller platforms be able to deal with something like terrorist content. They really recognize that even if you were to remove a live shooter video from one platform, people will re-upload it, and it becomes a shared responsibility of many companies to figure out how to deal with these challenges. So I think in the same way, all types of other content beyond terrorist content face similar challenges. It's very, very hard for companies with limited resources to have the right support, to have the right experts. And a lot of times they will choose to just ignore the problem, not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how. And they don't have the resources to hire a team to do that. And so they wait till something escalates to a certain point of maybe, safety risk that they decide to intervene. What's been really fascinating is there are certain trust and safety subfields. For example, dating companies face this challenge very directly in their bottom line. If you have an unhealthy community, people will tend to use the platform less. You do not want creepy people saying inappropriate stuff on a platform that will actually lose user trust directly. So you have examples like the dating space where people actually feel the toxicity much closer than others in which it's very easy to ignore or block somebody. So if you're on Twitter and you see some bullying happening, it's very easy for that to be potentially ignored. Whereas in a dating app, someone could take a screenshot and repost it somewhere. And you're gonna have the need for a number of different platforms to work with each other if a user ends up being at risk or at harm for that photo leaking, right? So those are different examples. And I think it is a shared responsibility of all platforms to learn about best practices, to learn about interesting tools to really support each other, because content isn't just on one platform anymore. Like I mentioned, it's everywhere. And the internet will be a more toxic place if there is no shared responsibility that everyone decides to work together on. Specifically around, terrorist content, I'll go back to that as an example. The companies came together and formed a hash sharing database where smaller platforms can then cross-check if there is specific terrorist content that they wouldn't otherwise independently be able to determine, and check from there if there are similar hashes for images and other types of materials that might live on their platform. So there's been a lot of progress that has been made, but there's also more challenges today more than ever. With COVID, misinformation, disinformation, it's not just content. There's so many other issues, from price gouging of masks, where people at companies have to decide what is acceptable and what's not for their marketplace vendors. There's so many other issues with offline safety when it comes to a virus and health conditions. There's also disinformation, right? It's not illegal to say that you should drink bleach, but maybe it should be removed if a lot of people end up seeing it come from an influencer that they trust, right? So it becomes very hard, and a lot of companies have actually taken different approaches around how they look at public figures and how they weigh in on policies that public figures might say versus just everyday individuals. Certain companies will look at the reach of a post. So they might allow a certain post to stay up if it doesn't have as much reach, but when it reaches a certain rate of spread, it could be very dangerous if a lot of people decide that it is true. So it's a very interesting and challenging environment, and it's one of the most interesting professional fields, in my opinion. People who have to deal with these very interesting 21st century challenges in an online space, working with all types of different organizations and experts to deal with decision making.
Well, absolutely. And it is, as you pointed out, such a broad field, and there's so much about what you're going to be dealing with that is unexpected, that it's so important that you have individuals at these companies that are able to handle a wide range of trust and safety issues. So on that note, I'd love to hear your opinion or your expert advice on what are the skill sets that an organization should prioritize when it comes to trust and safety.
Yeah, I wish I had those answers. Unfortunately, I don't. The analogy that I normally give is a lot of people come from trust and safety in very different backgrounds, and often accidentally. If you ask any trust and safety professional, they accidentally stumbled into the space and they fell in love with it. It's, certain people that hire for trust and safety teams have said they love people who really understand how users behave online, the quirky ways that they wouldn't do in an offline world. They might do it in an online space. There's other people that, that come from, for example, IP law backgrounds that are used to writing policies and making decisions in the gray. And they're often sometimes tapped in trust and safety teams to help define certain policies. You also have people that work their way up from more customer support functions that are really used to dealing with how people approach, spamming certain networks, and they end up in trust and safety that way. So there's so many different ways people end up in the space. There's also increasing experts in subtopics like terrorism, for example, or foreign influence operations or threat intelligence, right? That might come from backgrounds working in national security. So there's people coming from all different areas. And the reality is very much like there are experts in an offline world. In the online world, you need those similar skill sets. So there's just, a broad set of people that all find themselves in the space. The challenge right now in trust and safety is that it's just never been organized. So if you imagine if someone 15 years ago were to say, I'm going to be a data scientist when I grow up, or I'm going to be a privacy expert or the chief privacy expert of a company, you would have thought that person was insane because nobody really understood what online privacy meant. nobody quite understood what data science was as a field. Today, it's very, there's a lot of companies building out massive data science teams. There's chief data officers. Similarly, cybersecurity as a field didn't exist. There was a bunch of people that just loved understanding how network security works, right? And they were experimenting in their own best practices. And then ultimately, now there's master's programs and where you can learn techniques that people have honed over time. So those are a couple of examples, but really, I love the trust and safety community because it's very inclusive. It's very, very diverse, and it's really fun to just people who really care about the health of users, the safety of users, protecting the freedom of the internet, but also ensuring that there's certain boundaries that need to come into place to protect users in particular risks. And sadly, there's a lot of professionals that make these decisions that other teams are not too happy with, right? If you try to protect the user, you might limit advertising revenue if you have too many safety precautions in place. There's certain challenges around the value that certain executives see in the need to protect users. They may not see it as a responsibility. And you have people that are so used to seeing the harm that users are complaining about, and they get no support. So it's very challenging, but I think that's also what makes it really interesting right now. It's something that I think a lot of governments also are struggling with because they don't fully understand how products are built, the complexity of the types of decisions that certain companies and certain teams have to make. And a lot of times it's not a black and white decision by any means. And there's always going to be disagreements, just like in the policy world, when you're creating policy and thinking about policy that has to be enforced among every single American, right? You're not going to always be able to make a decision that satisfies everyone. Those are the same kinds of challenges that these professionals face as the policymakers of the internet.
So you mentioned several things that I would like to know more about, but one of the main things you mentioned that I want to dive into a bit further is about the safety by design approach versus just prioritizing growth. So what is the message that you would deliver to organizations that prioritize a frictionless user experience in order to drive growth over a safety by design approach, and perhaps at the sacrifice of their growth rate?
Yeah, so I think the problem of safety by design is very challenging. I think ambitiously every company wants to pretend or say that they're safe, and it's not even pretending. It's, they don't even realize a lot of times the offline consequences that their platforms might have. So there's always been a friction between Silicon Valley and DC, especially recently. And I don't think it's the intention of most entrepreneurs and technologists to create products that aren't safe. However, for most companies, the way that they grow from a startup to a large scale company is by venture capital investment. And a lot of the metrics that you need to go from Series A to Series B to Series C, if it's not by direct revenue, is by user numbers and growth. And so by the very nature of starting a company, you have to grow if you're not bringing in revenue. So I wouldn't say it's the fault of anyone creating a company, but I think it's the flaw of how companies work today, especially here in the US, and what is success metrics to them. You can either protect your users, but not be able to get funding to pay your employees, right? Or you're trying to create a safe product, but you grow so slowly, users decide they don't want to be on it anymore because they can't share as much as they would normally like to, or advertisers find that their content is being censored, right? So I think it's very, very challenging. There's more and more people thinking about these issues, even at educational institutions. So for example, Stanford has an internet observatory, and they recently rolled out a trust and safety course for their engineers that are learning about building technology. And I think a lot of that early education is definitely helpful to have approaches to say, hey, there is a way where you can grow and you can also be safe. but there is not enough current best practices of historic examples that exist today, which is a lot of what we're trying to do with the new organization, is be able to create case studies, be able to have examples so no one has to recreate the wheel and make similar mistakes that may have not had the best outcomes in the past. That would be my response. I think there's also more and more companies that have now ethics divisions that are helping their engineers and their product teams really understand how to take a more proactive approach to ethical product design. So I think that's very positive to see. I think it's very challenging at the same time for startups to really have the bandwidth and ability to think about this. And oftentimes it takes a company already at a certain level of growth to realize that they need the safety aspect of it.
Right, and that's such a good point. I think if you look at this on the surface, it's easy for people on the outside to say, this went wrong, this was a glaring safety problem, how could this not have been addressed sooner? But people on the outside aren't necessarily seeing not only kind of a culture of risk, I think, that is inherent in startups, but also all of the pressure they're under to grow and keep the company afloat. Sometimes you have to pick and choose which fires to put out and what to prioritize. So it's good to see that there are more developments currently to make trust and safety a priority and ethical design, all that kind of stuff, that it's becoming a bigger part of the conversation. I'm also interested in talking a little bit about how trust and safety relates to government and the legal side of things. So obviously, a lot of these issues that occur that we've been talking about, whether it's counterterrorism, child abuse, a lot of the really dangerous and toxic behaviors that you find on these platforms, there are legal repercussions. There are things that the government and law would need to be involved in. What kind of developments have you seen between the way that trust and safety of these businesses and government and legal are working together?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think the space in trust and safety that has been around the longest is definitely child exploitation online. There's a lot of consequences for fines that companies face if they have child pornography on their site, and as such, they'll invest in the technology, they'll invest in the resources to be able to detect that content and to take it down immediately. A lot of practices have evolved from child exploitation. Terrorist content uses a lot of technology that came from child exploitation, and things have continued to develop from there. But there's a lot of challenges. For example, around election security, there's a lot of politicians that believe certain speech should be censored online, and there's others that believe it shouldn't. A lot of times it might be weaponized and used for determining a certain election outcome when you decide to pressure companies to censor speech. So there's other instances where it's really hard for governments and companies to agree and be on the same page. With something like terrorist content, universally, you can say, we do not want terrorist groups and any bad actors to be online. But like I mentioned earlier, it's really hard sometimes to determine, to what line is drawn for a white supremacist extremist group to really break the law. And those are really, really hard. But content today can be massively amplified. Movements can be started much quicker in the online space, and that just becomes so much more challenging. To name a couple of examples, Germany, back in 2016, they passed a law called NetzDG to force companies to take down terrorist content within an hour. And when that law was passed, there was a number of challenges. Companies had to quickly hire people that could moderate content in German that didn't have German speakers. You had also politicians that were backing that legislation that saw themselves being censored. And there's been similar instances of this with other governments that really have forced companies to quickly censor, and they don't quite understand how this might actually impact other operations. And that comes from the disconnect between a lot of politicians really understanding the complexity of product design, and how day-to-day people working in trust and safety, how these decisions are made. At the same time, a lot of companies also have a hard time being transparent because they're still figuring it out, and they don't have good answers. And so I think that is one big challenge as the issues that take place in the offline world continue to grow online. We're going to continue to see is politicians and governments really wanting answers, and companies coming back with less clear answers because it's a hard problem. There's complex decisions being made, and it's not just a yes or no. There's very real decisions that companies have to weigh against on the values of their platform, what they want to allow, what they don't, and how they decide to comply. A lot of governments also are realizing that specifically around disinformation and misinformation, there really isn't any policy that they can really pass to enforce against companies. And so I think there's increased collaboration as a consequence of that. I think there's companies that have asked governments to regulate them. And then politicians for the first time are waking up and realizing just how challenging this is. So I wish I had a better answer, but I think, my big response in this space is I think there needs to be more politicians that spend time understanding how companies work, how trust and safety teams work, even spending time working in government, in companies to really see for themselves how difficult decisions are. And vice versa, more technologists to spend time in government to understand the complex decisions that they have to make to protect people for safety, right? Both online and offline. So I think increased collaboration will really help both sides of the aisle be able to speak with each other, not past each other. There's also a lot of governments that have invested in technology that they decide to build and ask companies to incorporate it. And a lot of times those have been mostly failures because they don't quite understand how to incorporate certain solutions inside the existing product structure of a platform. So a lot of the collaboration has been mostly in redirecting. If there's resources that companies need that they redirect to, whether that's, hey, this is the right website to use when you want to get information on how to vote. Or it could be around, hey, if you're searching for a lot of hate speech for white supremacist content, here's an organization like Life After Hate where you can get support. So there's been a lot of places where governments have been very helpful in redirecting companies to offer that to users, but there's a lot of tough decisions on both sides that have to be made.
Right, and like so many things, it often comes down to having more education and collaboration and understanding on both sides. So I think you make a really great point with that. So one final question for you. I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit more about your new organization that you're launching, the Trust and Safety Professional Association. So could you just tell us a little bit about the types of initiatives that you are planning to do with your new organization?
Yeah, I can talk about it at a pretty high level. It's not public yet, it's launching soon. By the time this podcast goes live, I'm sure we probably will be live. So there's more that can be found on the website, but we're really focused on 3 pillars. The first is around being able to bring the trust and safety community together. Like I mentioned before, there's a lot of professionals that have worked in this space, a lot of people that have pioneered trust and safety practices at different companies, but it's been very hard for people to know each other and be able to even connect with each other. Oftentimes, even professionals may not even be called under a trust and safety title. There's so many names that are used, community moderators, there's people that are vendors that do at-scale moderation that are sometimes outsourced by the large companies. There's so many different types of professionals. And what we're really hoping to do is organize the community and get people to know each other, because there's so many good best practices where people can learn from each other. Today, if you were, for example, a lawyer and you wanted to go to a conference about the latest in certain types of law, there are conferences for that. but there are no communities right now for trust and safety professionals. So that's the first pillar we're hoping we can bridge. The second is specifically around training. So if you wanted a historic example about how events like Gamergate has impacted content development over time, it's very hard to find that. And there's been people that have been part of that decision making and seeing events like that unfold that have been an important part of how different practices are adopted today. There's the blue check mark that everyone knows from Twitter for verifying profiles, right? And that was created in the early days of Twitter by Del Harvey, who's the VP of Trust and Safety there. And she really realized after working with a lot of child predators online that people will pretend to be other people they're not in the online space, and that profile verification is an important practice. So it's trainings like this, you know, historic and also current examples that we feel are so important. Even today, with the middle of COVID-19, there's been professionals trying new things that probably will be useful to share with other teams at other companies. And it's very hard for them to even share that out because there are so many silos for what teams can even share and where to find each other. So the second is training, and the third is around professional support. So if you were to work in trust and safety and you wanted to grow your career, there's always a ladder professionally for all types of fields. But in trust and safety, it's often hard because the work is tiring, hard, gruesome, a lot of hard decisions you're making. It's really hard to figure out how you can actually get to that next level. And a lot of people either burn out of the professional field or they have nowhere to go to learn about what's the next skill set that is needed. And so my co-founder, she often had to create different kinds of criteria for how she would promote within her team. And a lot of similar people that manage trust and safety teams have to do this by themselves too. It could be criteria, as I've mentioned before, around how good they are analytically. There's been increased companies that are looking for people with SQL backgrounds in trust and safety, right? So there's a lot of different skill sets that are emerging, and we hope that we can really help professionals stay motivated and continue to grow their careers and have different role models they can look up to, because there is so many good practices for how you succeed in this field that right now just isn't out in the open. So those are a little bit of a preview of the organization. And there's other things like a job board, right? So I know at Spectrum, you guys are hiring certain roles. If you wanted to find really savvy professionals to work in certain roles, it's also very hard to find trust and safety talent. And a lot of hiring managers don't know where to start. It's really easy to say you know something on a resume, but it's very hard to actually verify that you can do the work. The bar exam and the legal profession is a great way to say, hey, this is a test you passed to be a lawyer. In trust and safety, it's really hard to assess people equivalently. So there's other things that we're thinking about in terms of training to really help professionals have the ability to succeed everywhere from a trust and safety boot camp to other types of workshops around emerging topics. So I will pause there.
And can you tell everyone where they can find more information once your association goes live?
Yeah, right now we have a website. It's www.tspa.info, and you can find all the latest information there. There is also a separate organization called the Trust and Safety Foundation that is really around public education of the trust and safety field. So everything from what's a transparency report that companies are increasingly publishing to helping different governments and policymakers really understand how new practices that companies are adopting with more of a shared voice. So there's a lot of things that we're cooking up that will be announced soon. So we're excited to share more, and everything's available on our website.
And at Spectrum, we're so supportive of the work that you're doing with the Trust and Safety Professional Association. It's so important. You're tackling so many issues that we talked about today. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here, Clara.
Yeah, and thank you for your time. I know it's a crazy time for everyone, so I'm very blessed to be able to talk about this topic with you. And thank you to you and everyone at Spectrum for doing your part in protecting the safety of users online.
Thank you, and we will see you next time on The Brief.